Hey.
Hi.
Hello. Welcome back, Misfits, and welcome back to a new episode. Today, we're continuing the series of Who Are They? We're going to talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
I could go on forever saying that, though.
Yes.
Who are they?
Who are they? Is it you? Is it me? No. Who are they?
Let's get back on topic. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
but
reeling it back.
Yes.
We apologize for that.
Yeah.
It happens more often than you would know. I just cut it out. But anyway, we're talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and who they are. So, if you've read the Bible or even been to a few church services, there's a good chance you've heard of them. We're going to give you some backstory on them, so when you read about them in the Bible or hear them being talked about, you have a better idea of who they are. Mm-hmm. Now, these two groups were formed during the Second Temple period, which took place during 516 BC and 70 AD. This period, we're going to give you some background just so you kind of understand what happened. So the Second Temple period is marked by the return of the Jews to Jerusalem from their exile in Babylon. And we talked about this a couple episodes ago about how David was captive during the Babylonian period, just so you kind of have an idea of what was happening then. So once the Jews returned from their exile in Babylon in 538 BC, that's when this Second Temple period is going on. The Israelites, were allowed to return under an edict issued by King Cyrus of Persia. By 515 BC, the reinstated Jewish residents had completed building the Second Temple, right? So they were captive, now they're no longer captive, and then they rebuild the temple. So it is called the Second Temple period. And this is when these Pharisees and Sadducees are just running haywire. Yes. So now that we know when all this is taking place, we'll talk about the Pharisees and then sprinkle some information about the Sadducees. So let's get real basic here for a second. The dictionary defines a Pharisee as a member of an ancient Jewish sect, distinguished by strict observance of the traditional and written law, and commonly held to have pretensions to superior sanctity, and a self-righteous person, a hypocrite.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that second part, it's like, looking back, we understand that's what they were.
We understand, yeah. Haven't read the Bible and
I'm sure at
the Gospels,
the time,
like,
they were like, we know.
Yes.
And we're better than you.
We know things and you don't. Exactly.
But anyway.
So the term Pharisee comes from the Hebrew and Aramaic words of parush or parushi, which means one who is separated. The Pharisees were a Jewish religious group mentioned either collectively or as individuals 98 times in the New Testament, mainly in the Gospels. Mm-hmm. They were known as a society of scholars and priests and are mainly depicted as opponents of Jesus. In many ways, the Pharisees were very legalistic, but were also considered the best people in the whole country. They were the holy men who kept the law. They pursued purity with a passion and wanted nothing more than to live lives that pleased God. Although they had good intentions, they were misguided, as we see in the Gospels. They were so concerned with their quote-unquote rules that they didn't even recognize the Messiah.
Yeah, I think they definitely like they sounded good on paper, right?
Yes.
Kind of thing, like, wow, you're doing all this stuff. But really, when you looked at what they actually did in the practice, like, they were just kind of going about it the wrong way.
Yes, definitely. I think they had good intentions.
Yes.
But literally just going about it the wrong way.
So
in the Bible, as many of you may know, the Pharisees are portrayed as nitpicky enforcers of Jewish law, who are so focused on the letter of the law that they miss the spirit entirely.
Right.
Pharisees believed a Messiah would come who would bring peace to the world, but most of them did not think that Messiah was Jesus. They taught that their oral tradition went all the way back to Moses at Mount Sinai. So not only was there a written Torah, as we've mentioned before, the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. So not only was there a written Torah, which anyone could have access to, but there was also an oral Torah, which was inside the Pharisaic movement. What was interesting about the oral tradition of the Pharisees was that it expanded the question of purity to life outside of the temple. Because of this, the Pharisees became a movement for purity of Jewish people. A teaching moment here. So it speaks about how there's the Torah, which is the written tradition, right? The five first books of the Bible. And then there is an oral tradition. So the oral tradition later gets transcribed and is now known as the Talmud. Essentially, the Talmud is a legal commentary on the Torah. So what it does is that it explains how its commandments are to be carried out. So basically, the Torah tells you to do something, and the Talmud explains to you how to do that.
Okay, just like an instructive.
And that was the oral part that the Pharisees believed in. So they just thought it was a two-parter. And then getting teachy again, as we were doing research, we found that the Pharisees thought that God could and should be worshipped even away from the temple and outside of Jerusalem. To the Pharisees, worship consisted of prayer and the study of God's law. So the Pharisees fostered the synagogue as an institution of religious worship, outside and separate from the temple. Because of this, the synagogue could be considered a Pharisaic institution, since the Pharisees developed it, raised it to high eminence, and gave it a central place in Jewish religious life. So I thought that was cool, because I know what a synagogue is, and to me, a synagogue is just like a Jewish church.
Yes.
But apparently, the Pharisees were so involved in prayer and just being pure outside of the temple that they created this whole new institution.
A second place to go
right.
to.
And it's interesting because I found that the synagogues were more of, basically they were just a meeting place, like a community meeting place that anything can happen.
Not like a normal church that you think of.
And then it kind of developed into
what it's now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh. So it's cool.
Yeah.
Nice little tidbit.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Sadducees. We're going to just get basic and then give you some backstory. So again, the dictionary defines a Sadducee as a member of a Jewish sect or party of the time of Jesus Christ that denied the resurrection of the dead, the existence of spirits, and the obligation of oral tradition, emphasizing acceptance of the written law alone, or the Torah. The Sadducees and the Pharisees were in constant conflict with each other, not only over many details of ritual and the law, but most importantly over the content and extent of God's revelation to the Jewish people. The Sadducees refused to go beyond the written Torah, again, the first 5 books of the Bible, and like the Pharisees, they denied the existence of afterlife, the immortality of the soul, and the existence of angels or spirits. So they were very concentrated kind of on what they believed.
Right.
And had a lot of things that they just
they're like, if it's not in the Torah, I don't believe it.
Yes. Yeah. Very limited, I guess. So we read in Acts 23:8, the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. So you kind of see the difference between these two groups there.
Yes.
The Sadducees were a part of a high priest, aristocratic families, and merchants, the wealthier elements of the population. So they dominated the temple and its priesthood over the Pharisees.
Yeah, so they had money and prestige.
Yeah, these were wealthy, well-known.
It's interesting because I think that sometimes when we don't know, we read the Bible and we think the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So we think they're similar and that they kind of did the same thing. But there was beef.
Yeah. There's definitely a difference in what you called who, because of their status or the amount of money they had. Yeah, so that's very interesting. The Sadducees were the powerful elite of first century Judaism. They were a priestly class that controlled temple worship and held the most political influence with the Roman Empire, which ruled over Palestine. The Sadducees rejected the oral tradition in favor of the written law. The religious responsibilities included the maintenance of the temple in Jerusalem. Their high social status was reinforced by their priestly responsibilities as mandated in the Torah. The priests were responsible for performing sacrifices at the temple, which was the primary method of worship in ancient Israel. And this included presiding over sacrifices during the 3 festivals of pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So to get teaching again, these two parties, quote unquote, served in the Great Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the ancient Jewish court system, sort of like a Jewish Supreme Court, made up of 71 members whose responsibility was to interpret civil and religious law.
Yeah.
So they were high up, very important as far as the temple and priests goes. So that's the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. A lot of it had to do with their stature and money, and of course some very important parts of their beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's very interesting, interesting, and we're happy to have learned this because, like I said, when you read it, sometimes you think it's the same people or that they did some things,
or that they're very interchangeable,
right?
Even.
And actually, they had very different beliefs and very different responsibilities. Although it was interesting that they're part of this like Jewish Supreme Court.
Yes,
and they both kind of had to work together. Even though they kind of
kind of fought against each other because
I don't believe what you believe. It's very interesting. We hope that you found it as interesting as we did.
Yeah.
And we hope that you learned something today.
Yes.
And that concludes this series for us. So we hope that you enjoyed it, and then we hope that you learned something about the Israelites, the Gentiles, and then the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And we hope
if there's any other groups that you read about and want us to kind of dive in, we'd love to do that.
We will do the homework for you because we enjoy it. Yes. So we hope you enjoyed it. And as always, this is Fran.
This is Yadi.
We are the Midtown Misfits, and we will see you next week.
Bye.